Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I apologise, I'll be presenting in Australian English, so I apologise to all the English and Spanish speakers. Someone who's in the front row over here recently told me it's a surprise I can do anything in Mexico because no one understands anything I'm saying, so bear with me. So today I want to talk about Heliostar's approach to building what we believe will be the next new large gold mine in Mexico at Ana Paula. I'll start with a few high-level slides to talk about what our vision for the project is and how we've changed the approach to it, and then dive into a more technical presentation talking about some of the rocks, alteration, paragenesis. And so it's only been just a little over 12 months since we acquired Ana Paula. We paid $10 million to acquire the project with subsequent success payments as we take it into construction. But we bought it with a very different view to how it's been seen before. Our approach was that you could think about this deposit as a giant sea of low grade that's probably marginal economically, with these core structures in the middle that contain very high grade that's extremely attractive from an economic perspective. And so we recognise that there's this high-grade panel of gold mineralisation, about 100 metres tall, 280 metres wide, 280 metres long and 60 metres wide, 60 metres wide, that's running consistently 5 to 15 grams per tonne gold. An incredibly well-mineralised disseminated gold system. And that drives the economics for this project. And so last year our whole focus was on rescoping this project with this view in mind. So we significantly expanded the size of the resource and changed it to an underground focused resource. We demonstrated that there was a lot simpler metallurgy in the core part of the deposit, which is probably the most value additive thing we did. The drill holes always get the headline, but that metallurgy is a step change for processing the high grade panel. We showed that there's over 200,000 ounces at better than 10 grams, which is well located to be the start of the mine life and should drive a very, very quick payback for the deposit. And now this year, we're pivoting to bring it online and executing on that change strategy. And so we're working on a PEA that'll feed into a FS study next year. But we also recognised Ana Paula's a little unique. It's had $100 million invested into it. It's got camp, it's got power, it's got a portal. It's got a third of a decline, if that makes sense, a third of a decline that was planned to go 1,200 metres in. And it has its open pit mining permit, and that decline is permitted. So it's got a lot of valuable features that allow us to move very quickly. And so our intention is to complete the decline, use that as a production decline for test mining, and then ultimately permit steady state production as a way to bring production forward, and as a smaller company financing our first mine, owning more of that as we go forward. And this month we announced a $20 million debt facility that's going to provide the funding for us to complete that decline and do that test mining. So a very significant step forward that means we don't need equity markets to deliver this test mining scenario, and then we hope to permit that modification to the MIA to become a steady state underground operator and scale that up to what we think will ultimately be about 100,000 ounces of gold production per year. And so where that comes from is a view of the resource, an image on the left and an updated resource table on the right. You can see the high-grade panel and you can see those high cut-offs, everything pink above 5 grams per tonne, everything magenta above 10 grams per tonne. And a reinforcement that this is a 60 metre, like well wider than this room as the width of that zone. And so that leads to very favourable economics that I think is going to give some really attractive returns when we show the economics of Ana Paula at the PEA. We've got over 700,000 ounces at 6.6 grams in the M&I and another 450 at 4.2 in the inferred. We lifted the M&I resource grade by 36% with the infill drilling we did. Because it had been drilled for an open pit, it was quite widely spaced drilling. And so we saw a lot of continuity in the geology that wasn't well represented in the resource model. And so by infilling those holes, we're able to connect a lot more high-grade ounces, and that's why we're able to lift the grade so much in that resource update. There's not many projects in the world where you can consistently drill 50 to 100 metre holes at 5 to 15 grams per tonne gold. And that's why the core of Ana Paula is so unique. It's consistently wide and high grade. And so moving in that context to a little more of a technical discussion on the project, we're located 4 hours south of Mexico City in Guerrero, immediately northwest of Torex's Morelos complex. We've got really good road access, power, facilities. We own or have 30-year access agreements for the surface rights. So we were fortunate to inherit a quite advanced project from a permitting and studies to production pathway. And you know, credit to particularly the work that Timmins into Alio did in that time. We're very fortunate for some of the foresight of the decisions that they took in the period of time that they owned the asset. And so if we zoom a little bit more into the geology, here's our view, sort of focused on our view of the Guerrero Gold Belt. You can see the Los Filos complex to the south. You can see Media Luna, the new development, and Limon that Torex are operating. And you can see our very large 55,000 hectare land package, including Ana Paula shown on it today. There's a huge amount of prospectivity in the rest of the district, but Ana Paula has been the focus for everyone who's owned it for the last few years, and honestly, we're in the same boat. You know, it takes a lot of time and attention to do what we're doing, so we haven't yet had a chance to sort of cast out and see what other dots we can add to that map beyond Ana Paula. You know, there's probably a number of people in this room who know the Guerrero Gold Belt a lot better than I do, but it's an over 50 kilometre long trend of intrusions into predominantly limestone or limey sediment sequences that drive proximal to distal skarns and epithermal associated mineralisation. Ana Paula is a little bit unique relative to the other deposits, and it definitely is a more distal signature, and I'll run through some of the evidence for that today. If you just sort of step back in that regional context again, you know, the large Jurassic metamorphic complex in the southern part of Mexico, and divided into a number of terrains. The Guerrero Gold Belt crosses from the Mixteca terrain in the southeast up into the Teloalpan terrain in the northwest. We've got a slightly different view to maybe some of the previous explorers. We think, and I'll explain why, that Ana Paula is actually hosted in the Teloalpan terrain, a slightly older belt of rocks thrust over the top that then the intrusions came through and mineralised. We don't think we'd say that definitively, but we're pretty confident that that's an updated interpretation, that we're on the left side of that domain boundary, maybe only by a couple of kilometres, and sitting over top of thrust over the top of younger Mixteca terrain. And if we zoom in to look at the project geology at a bit more scale, what should stand out, or in colour-wise stands out the most, is that large yellow zone, a large sort of massive limestone package that then on top of that sits the more distal outboard sedimentary package that you can see in the dark blue, and then the volcanic rocks or a mixture of sediments with the odd volcanic layer in the light green there. And we believe that that's a significant thrust contact through this area through here, and that these rocks to the left are thrust over the top of this classic setting to the right. And that's the setting that you can see the Morelos complex hosted in, the cleaner, deeper limestones in the sequence. So interestingly, we think that we're in the most shallow part of the system. This is an old diagram that I haven't updated because I think it does a pretty good job of showing the different erosion levels. And so you can see that the intrusions as you step from southwest at Los Filos up to northwest where we are at Heliostar. And you can see you're getting deeper. I think these are coloured for blue for hornfells and red for skarns. And we're getting up into the more volcanic layers up to the top. So we're at the shallowest level of erosion relative to the other two deposits, which is pretty exciting from a depth potential perspective at Ana Paula, that you should be able to chase that down potentially into the clean limestones, into the contact skarn style mineralisation that you see at the likes of Media Luna or around the edges of Los Filos. So going deeper at Ana Paula is one of the most exciting exploration upside targets on the project. You can also see the series of magnetic highs defining a number of intrusions that define the belt. I think the rule is you want to be around them, but you don't have to be on them. I think it's been well demonstrated, and I think David Jones did it in a number of presentations, that you don't necessarily want to be on the mag highs, but you definitely want to be associated with those mag highs as the younger intrusions that are driving the gold mineralisation into these systems. And so if we zoom in a bit further and look at this sort of squashed octopus, this represents the geology at the deposit scale. In the blue, representing that background of limey sediments that are predominant through the land package, and then a number of intrusions that form in the eastern part, a whole series of predominantly sills with maybe some minor dikes, and a more coherent stock on the western side. They've been dated, lead uranium age dating showing sort of 66 to 68 million years fits exactly with the age bracket of the other mineralisation in the gold belt. A little bit of variation between the intrusions, but very similar, all very similarly related, and they probably evolve from pre-mineral. We believe this big stock to the west is a pre-mineral intrusive, as I'll talk about as we go into some of the breccia textures. Definitely a syn mineral intrusive phase and possibly even post-mineral, but I don't think we've done enough work to define that. And so if we look at those instead of on a map as the different rock types, most of the geology, even though it only gets one picture here, is thinly bedded calcareous limestone and shales. We do get occasional thicker, more clean limestone units, but we're talking on the order of 5 to 10 metres. We're not talking about massive limestone packages. A lot of thin bedded sediments dominate, probably 70% of the rock volume at Ana Paula. And the reason that one of the key reasons that we think we might be in this slightly older terrain is twofold. One is it doesn't quite fit with the facies description of the Quettler Formation that this has previously been described in. And we see a number of thin bedded lapilli tuff layers, which are not known to be in the Quettler Formation. So we think that's a little bit of a smoking gun for the fact that we are in that older sequence and that it's sitting on top. So there's quite a few of these. They're pretty thin. They can be on the size, as thin as your fingernail, up to maybe 0.5 metre in size. And that they're volumetrically insignificant, but they're pretty material observation in terms of what it might mean for the age of the host rock at Ana Paula. And then onto the intrusions that are predominantly pre-mineral. You can see, a huge amount there, a huge area of the stock being this large crowded intrusive, a feldspar biotite intrusive phase that then also makes the sills. That's probably evolving from pre-mineral into syn mineral as it starts to create all those sill sequences. It has a few variations. You can see it less crowded, like this image here on the bottom right. You can see some foliations in a couple of them, but they're all members of the same family of intrusives to our knowledge so far. We've been trying to find a sort of a causative intrusion that we can put our finger on and chase down, but we think that we're above the level of the causative intrusions and we're going to have to go deeper to find those at Ana Paula. Oops. Just going to try and get out of this menu. Is that menu me or? Thank you. So I think the part of the geology we've presented, there's no controversy, but I've never talked about breccias in my entire career without causing a massive argument amongst all the geos involved. Breccias are a key part of the host rock of mineralisation at Ana Paula, and I think that's a key differentiator to make off the bat. We believe that the high-grade panel is hosted in a breccia that is pre-mineral, not a causative breccia. We think it just makes a very favourable trap site. And so what you're looking at here on the left is a cross-section that's looking to the west over 1 kilometre vertical. There's one very deep hole drilled to chase this down. And so you can see in black the sediments, in pink the sills that have come through, and then you can see this sort of on average sort of 40 to 60 metre wide breccia pipe. We've zoomed into the top part here so you can see it a bit more, and we've overlaid in yellow where we get better than 2 grams per tonne gold. And you can see the relationship with the breccia, particularly in a long section where it flares out to greater width in what's likely a diatreme control, that it makes this beautiful porous sponge that's probably quite chemically reactive, and that's why you get such spectacularly consistent widths and grade in the gold mineralisation. We believe it to be a phreatic breccia. I'll show some of the rock textures in a second. We break it into 2 sections. We interpret a rock flower matrix in the top part of the system, and by the time you get to the bottom part of this breccia, you get an igneous matrix infill of that breccia. So it is changing within the column of the within the breccia column. And so to look at some of those textures, I've pulled out a few photos here. In the top left, a pretty classic example of what we call the polymictic breccia for short, but a polymictic fragmental matrix breccia. So a breccia that's made up of rock flower of components are just finer and ground parts of what you see in the clasts. You can see that it's sort of subangular to sort of sub-rounded in nature, a number of different intrusive clasts of different types, and a number of different sandstone clasts of different types, limey sandstones, and then a real rock flower core. Here's a version of it on the right where the clasts are starting to get more rounded. You know, we think there's been a bit of volatilisation and a bit of streaming that rounded those clasts in the breccia column. It's not that common, but it does happen. It just shows you there's a bit of movement. There's very few exotic clasts, so most of the breccia clasts haven't moved or travelled that far within the breccia column. We think if we ultimately do some detailed work, which we have planned, we might even be able to sort of crudely map some of those like limestone layers, sill layers, even through the breccia, or at least we'd like to hope we would, which is why we're going to attempt that. But as we step to the bottom, we start to get an igneous matrix to this same breccia. So here, mostly sandstone clasts, all igneous matrix infilling all the gaps, and then even sort of entrainment of some of this rock flower, some of this matrix material caught up, which makes us think that this magma was injected post or syn formation of this breccia. You know, you can go one step further in the bottom right, where you can then even get clasts where it's starting to break up this fragmental matrix breccia. So we think you've got an early phreatic breccia that's being driven by these intrusives coming in, and then the igneous matrix another magma source is coming in and just replacing ultimately the rock flower matrix, or as you get deeper, becoming the matrix itself. And we think that all happened predating the mineralisation. We see both the intrusions, this igneous material, and the intrusions themselves do create local sort of skarn and hornfels alteration, but it's on the order of centimetres outside of the intrusion. It's not driving the big hydrothermal alteration footprint. We believe that comes and gets imposed on this pre-set up series of host rocks. And so if you start to look at what that alteration looks like, here's a couple of examples. You can see the sediments at the top of this tray, the intrusion at the bottom, and in the middle, where the rock's more siliciclastic, a sort of pretty classic hornfels horizon developed. They can get over sort of tens of metres of sort of slightly weaker than this, but they're most commonly expressed right on the contact, and you can see the contact with the intrusion right here. If that same intrusion, note we've flicked around, we've got the intrusion at the top of up here and the sediments at the bottom. If the sequence is more limey, then it expresses a more classic prograde skarn assemblage. Again, not really controlling gold mineralisation, but we think the sills make great fluid pathways. So you do often see a lot of alteration on these contacts, but we think it's more of a coincidence of the plumbing network and not anything to do with this earlier phase of hornfels or skarn mineralisation. And then if we dive into what is a sort of a working model paragenesis we have, and I owe thanks to Chris Lloyd's work, where I'm stealing and presenting Chris' work here. So he spent a significant amount of the time on the call coming up with this. It's still a work in progress as we continue to understand more about the deposit, but it gives us a good working base for our understanding of Ana Paula. And so we think the earliest phase of veining that we have at Ana Paula is related to deformation and folding of the sedimentary sequence. So just remobilisation of calcite veins that's unrelated to the Guerrero Gold Belt style mineralisation and a function of the deformation of the host rocks. Then we get an early event of sort of quartz pyrite mineralisation that's pretty limited, sort of fine-grained pyrite that we don't see a lot of and is dominantly overprinted by the first major gold event in our opinion, which is what we call the V2 event. And I find the V2 event really interesting because it expresses in a number of different ways based on the rock type that it's going into. And so we'll show here a number of the different types of alteration or of vein formation that you can create in this event. It's an arsenopyrite gold rich event. You can see it forming here in the intrusive as significant quartz sulfide microveinlets. They then typically evolve into these hydraulic breccias. So not to be confused, in our opinion, with the lithological breccias, for want of a better term. These are cracking open the rock as the fluids come into the rock. And if the rock's brittle or hard, they fracture it. And if the rock's soft or porous, they just pervasively replace the matrix. And so the manifestation, the intrusions, you can get these sort of mossy veinlet types. You can get sheeted veins. They're quite rare but quite distinctive and sometimes have coarse gold, some of the few coarse gold samples that we've seen. As it comes into the sediments, you can see it cracking open the sediments and then pervasively just running along the beds, replacing the sediments. This can create some really spectacular high grade on the edges of the breccia. Runs of 5 to 20 metres at 20 to 30 grams gold. You can see it as these sort of wispy microfractures as the intrusion, all things that we think are just slightly different manifestations of the same fluid event based on the host rock that it goes into. And then we think there's another event, a more pyrite-dominated event that also brings gold in. It's possible that it's remobilising gold, but we think it's reasonably clear that it's a second gold-rich pulse. And you can see that as the sort of quartz pyrite, sometimes with anchorite veins, and there's a couple of examples of it here. One as it fractures through the intrusives, another as it's just pervasively replacing bedding or fractures in the sediments. We think that the key control to mineralisation at Ana Paula is porosity. If you find porosity, you're likely to find gold. It's a system just swamped in gold over, the low-grade halo is 1.5 kilometres by over 1 kilometre. And so it's just looking for any trap site to deposit that gold. I think there's a little bit of chemistry involved in terms of there is more favourable units to drop out into, but the Breccia shows us that porosity is king. Any fault, any Breccia is the key in our opinion. And then a couple of later events, a sort of white quartz sulfide vein event, some common throughout the deposit but volumetrically insignificant grey quartz veins. And then lastly, a significantly younger epithermal event. We see probably one every 15 metres of these. They can be up to 0.5 metre wide, but they're typically what you see here. Grade destructive when you see them, very clearly stripping grade out of Ana Paula. And we think a much younger, just later overprint of the deposit itself. And so I think the way we think about Ana Paula is a new interpretation that we have is these structural controls that either hold, we believe an east-west structure controlled the emplacement of the major Breccia unit in the high-grade panel, or these parallel structures to the north that I'll introduce are really attractive targets for high-grade gold mineralisation. And because most of the drilling was tracking bedding that's plunging to the west, there's just not enough north to south or south to north drill holes. So the door's actually quite open to continue to find more of these high-grade structures as we continue to drill and understand Ana Paula a little better. I think it's fair to say we've still got a long way to go, but we're starting to get an understanding of it. And we think this is a good synthesis of those events. You can see the early V2, a number of the different styles of that V2 forming everything from everything from sort of coherent structures to then starting to break out into forming a breccia and the intrusive rock. Then you see these overprinting V3 veins, a later V5 here, and then finally the late quartz one. So a nice little Rosetta Stone that Chris put together showing that paragenesis on a single slide. It's definitely a complex, long-lived, multi-phase intrusion system. And I think as we do more work, we'll recognise there's more overlaps and more complexity even in that interpretation. And I think I like putting this slide in both because it was a 2017 Discoveries Conference that Dave Jones presented this at, and I think it's a great working model for finding more deposits in the Guerrero Gold Belt. And so David, and you can see the link down there, it's actually on Minorum's website. If anyone wants to go, and if you're interested in Guerrero geology, I think it's probably the best. Unfortunately we can't talk to Dave, so it's Dave talking to us. I wasn't going to say that. But I think it's a great presentation. I love that it's stored for people who want to learn about Guerrero geology. And he breaks the world into a simple contact model and a complex contact model, and I think it holds really well. So here's the intrusion that we talked about. In his model, he was focusing just on the clean limestones, and you have a classic exoskarn coming off those. Dave likens them to Nukai, Los Fielos, and Bermejo. Whereas the Ana Paula example fits into what he calls the complex contact model. Yes, you have the skarn, but here you either have a breccia unit or a thrust fault that allows the fluids to go up and away from the intrusions and react with more siliciclastic rocks, creating a much larger hornfels footprint. And this is the part of Ana Paula that we're in, and what's particularly exciting is we can chase that down to having this sort of simple contact model at depth. I think the deeper potential at Ana Paula is pretty exciting. And so in terms of how do we deploy that and what are our immediate targets at Ana Paula? So we've got that resource, a bit over 1 million ounces, so the 700 in indicated, measured and indicated, 450 in inferred. We think we can grow that to 1.5 million ounces at better than 5 grams per tonne in the next resource update. And where we think that comes from is we think there's more ounces for us to add in this high-grade panel. Here's where we're going to run this decline in, and our immediate focus is sort of say everything above the decline. I think we can grow this to 1.5 to 2 million ounces above here, and then we'll come down and look at these deeper targets. There's areas like 13 metres at 29 grams, 40 metres at 6, 11 metres at 4, really nice deeper mineralisation that we really want to be drilling from the decline because the topography this way is reasonable, but if I go the other way, it's quite steep. And so we want the decline in to have the best angled holes and easier ability to go and test the depth potential of Ana Paula. We're not the only ones who think it's a good target because Alio was pushing this decline in to do exactly the same thing. And you don't start pushing a decline in without some optimism of the potential of the deposit. If we look immediately behind this high-grade panel, so 50 metres behind this screen, we recognised another parallel zone, the parallel panel, which we had some suspicions of, but there was an element of luck that we had to come through it to get to the high-grade panel. And we really believed that it was a real zone sort of Q3 last year. We were able to drill holes like 38 metres at 7 grams, 16 metres at 11, 15 metres at 5. I think there's another 100 to 300,000 ounces in this parallel east-west structure to the north when we can systematically drill this off when the rigs start drilling again in the next couple of months when we close this debt financing package that we're doing. And if you extend that even further, you're now looking at a plan map with the footprint of the resource clipped to only showing the 2 gram and above material. If I clip this to 0.5 grams, there'd be green all through this whole area. And what we noticed in the resource, we've got the high-grade panel structure hosting the breccia, this parallel zone immediately to the north. There's only a few holes here, and they're all west to east holes. They've got some interesting hits, 10 metres at 5, 10 metres at 4, 7 metres at 4. And the resource models just turn them into blobs because they're not very well constrained. We'd like to believe, when we get a bit optimistic, that there's a lot more of these east-west structures, sorry, I pressed the wrong button, up to the north, and we plan to step out and try and test those with north-south drilling to see if these little zones are going to hang together as more east-west high-grade gold structures. And so I think a nice slide to close on is standing on Ana Paula looking to the south. The best place to go and look for big deposits is where there's other massive deposits. You can see the Morelos complex here, about a 15 million ounce deposit if you go through production history, resources and reserves. And then you go 30 k's away and you've got what Los Filos must total close to 20 million. So we're in a part of the world that creates very big ore bodies. We're standing here on Ana Paula, and I think we've really only just scratched the surface of the deposit at Ana Paula, and we'll continue to add ounces. I think we can comfortably grow at 1.5 to 2 million ounces, and then we'll go deeper and see whether we can turn it into a deposit anywhere near the size of its neighbours. And so, being a technical conference, I'll take the indulgence to thank everyone at the Heliostar team. None of this work I really did. I'm just taking the credit for it and presenting it. So to everyone who's worked on the Heliostar team, in alphabetical order, we listed the major contractors who have worked with us. We wouldn't have the project at the point we have without that help. And finally, thank you to everyone for coming in the conference. I think it's a great conference to Mexico, and I love having the chance to present. So thank you.